Welcome to the VSC Healing Begins Here podcast series. The Victim Service Center, or the VSC, is a nonprofit organization that provides free, individualized counseling and other services to survivors of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. Today, we will be talking about healing after assault, and with us today to talk more about the services the VSC provides to the community is the VSC Program Director, Joellen Ravel. So welcome, and thank you so much for being here today,
It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. So to start off, can you just tell us a little bit about the VSC services that we provide to survivors?
Absolutely. Victim Service Center is a nonprofit agency, and we've been around for about 21 years. And there are several things that we do. One of the main things I want to talk about is our 24/7 sexual assault helpline. That runs all the time by master's level counselors. And it's really the main access point for individuals who want to reach our services. So with that, someone may call and they might call and they want to discuss a little bit about their own personal history. They might be a family member of someone who's been sexually assaulted and want to ask some questions, or they could be a professional calling on behalf of a victim and want to make a connection. Beyond the sexual assault helpline, we do have a forensic nursing program, and that is for acute sexual assault, which is a situation where within 120 hours, which is 5 days, the person was sexually assaulted. And we can collect evidence by one of our nurse examiners for individuals who are 12 years old and older. And then beyond that, we have a core advocacy team, and they provide a great amount of personal advocacy and emotional support, criminal justice navigation, and a variety of victim compensation assistance. And then the final category we have is our therapy department for individuals who really want to heal and spend a while and a long time working with an individual counselor on their healing journey.
Absolutely. So I know that we also have some support groups and things like that.
Absolutely. Sometimes it's the advocacy department who leads our support groups, and other times we have closed therapy groups. We have a variety of support groups. I'm very proud to say we offer support groups for females, males. We offer support groups in Spanish. We offer support groups for the LGBTQ population. We also have a dedicated support group for Black survivors of sexual violence. So there are many options, and I would encourage people who are interested to call the helpline or call the office and look to find out what might work for them.
That's so awesome. I love that we have different kinds of support groups for all kinds of survivors. And I know that we work with survivors of any kind of trauma. So what can trauma look like?
Well, that's a great point. Many people know us as the Sexual Assault Treatment Center, the Rape Crisis Center. And it's true, 90% of our clients do have a history of sexual violence. But we do work with persons who have experienced other crime, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's kidnapping, family members who survived the death, a homicide of a loved one, even carjackings. These things happen and they have a huge impact on individuals. So trauma, I really think, is a self-defined issue. Certainly, people can be diagnosed with PTSD, but ultimately, we're looking to work with individuals who've went through something that has made an impact on their life and has changed their way of thinking about safety, their own protection. Sometimes it can look to a person that they have completely broken down. There's a lot of depression. There's difficulty coping.
Right.
We have to consider that trauma for individuals is individualized based on whether or not they've already suffered multiple traumas, the age that they are when this trauma has occurred, and any previous coping mechanisms they might have had.
Absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate that. I know that healing could look different for everyone.
Absolutely.
And that's what we're here for, to talk about today. Do survivors need to report in order to get our services, or is reporting necessary?
That's a really good point. So generally the population might think a crime has occurred, we need to report, but that is not the case for sexual assault survivors that are adults. And although we work with law enforcement for those who choose to report, there are a number of individuals who are not ready to report their crime. They prefer to just be connected. to understand what their rights are as a victim, to be made aware of what the next steps are in terms of reporting, what that may look like, questions that might be asked, if the case is going to be prosecuted, things of that sort. So generally speaking, the answer is no, you don't have to report. There are some conditions we have to consider. If it's a minor child, we have to think about mandating reporting. If it's an adult who's vulnerable, perhaps someone who's disabled, or an individual who's elderly who is taken advantage of, we would have to look at that situation, and as mandated reporters, we might have to contact the authorities.
Absolutely. And, another question that I had is, there's this concept of closure, I think, sometimes. So how can a VSC advocate or the VSC kind of help a survivor with the concept of closure or getting closure that they're looking for?
I appreciate that you brought that up. I think it's very important to understand that everyone is going to heal their own way. What happened to someone doesn't necessarily mean everything's resolved if the person who harmed them is convicted, because there's emotional healing that has to happen. So oftentimes when we talk to a victim and we discuss what their options are, if they want to report, if they want to move forward, they may really want to do that. And for that individual, that is important for them. And we will encourage that and we will support that. We also talk to them about what would happen if the outcome is not what they anticipated.
Right.
Even if they did everything they needed to do and a jury chose not to convict them, what does that look like? How can they heal beyond the criminal justice system? And so with that being said, individuals and their advocate and or therapist will work on what the healing journey is for someone, what would be beneficial, and how can they feel at the end that they have a sense of closure.
Absolutely. And what would you say to a survivor who may be nervous, like reaching out to the VSC, who might have some reservations, who's afraid of, reaching out because they may not be believed or things like that?
Well, first of all, I would thank a survivor for calling. When people call the office and I have the pleasure of picking up the phone, I always acknowledge to them that they found the right place. We're going to help. I'm glad that they reached out. So that's first. Starting by believing is essential. Everyone at the Victim Service Center does start by believing, and we will ultimately always make sure that they're being heard and what they want to do for their individual plan is carried on.
Absolutely. And I think a big decision could be if a survivor does want to report. So how can the VSC help a survivor make that decision if they're not sure?
Sharing information about the process is ultimately what we want to do. We do have great connections with law enforcement in our community. We work together on a sexual assault response team. Because we have good rapport, if somebody is concerned about the process, maybe the advocate can call over to whether it's Orlando Police or the Sheriff's Office and have a conversation with a detective that they know, and they can set up an appointment, and together they could be there so that the victim is supported.
Absolutely. And before we sign off here, just wanted to ask, is there anything else that you would like to share to the survivors who may be listening? Anything that you want to add that we may not have covered?
I would just say that it is a very courageous thing to reach out, and we appreciate anyone who encourages others to do so. At the Victim Service, our agency and our staff is dedicated to help victims, to heal victims. And I can tell you that we have so many surveys of clients who've been with us, and they have shared things about the experience was life-changing. They've never dedicated themselves to kind of healing before this, and now that they have, they've changed their lives. So I can tell you from being here 8 years, I know that there is success. And I know sometimes it's very difficult for survivors. It's not always a perfect ending, but there are a lot of lessons to be learned. There's a lot of growth opportunities. And when you work with an advocate or a therapist, you really can find out a lot about yourself, and you can truly begin to become a thriver from sexual violence.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Joellen, for being here and talking about the amazing services that the VSC helps for survivors.
Thank you for having me.
And when we come back, we will be joined by Detective Rick Salcedo from the University of Central Florida's Police Department to discuss what that process can look like, so stay tuned. Welcome back to the VSE Healing Begins Here podcast series. In this next segment, we are joined by Detective Rick Salcedo from the University of Central Florida's Police Department to chat about one option survivors have, reporting. So welcome, Detective Salcedo. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to ask you first if you could start off talking a little bit about the law enforcement agencies in Orange County.
Okay, so there are several law enforcement agencies in Orange County. The biggest one is the Orange County Sheriff's Office. They are responsible for investigating cases in the unincorporated areas of Orange County. Then you have the Orlando Police Department, who investigate cases within the city of Orlando.
Okay.
UCF Police Department investigates cases on the main campus, downtown campus, and the Lake Nona College campuses. And then you have the other smaller agencies such as Maitland, Apopka, Ocoee, to name a few. They handle all the cases that occur within their jurisdiction. So it all depends on where the incident occurred and what agency is going to investigate it.
Okay, got it. So we've got a sheriff's department, and then we also have smaller agencies like police departments within that.
Yeah, throughout the county.
Okay, got it. I didn't know that. So what is actually a special victims unit, and why is it important that we have that?
Okay, a special victims unit is a company called SVU, and they are responsible for investigating sex crimes cases, sexual assault cases. The unit's called Special Victims because we deal with individuals who's just been through a very traumatic experience. So we need to be able to send detectives and officers who know how to handle that type of crime.
Right.
So they use the victim-centered approach and the trauma-informed technique when they interview these victims. It's also very difficult case to prove in court. So we need to use especially trained detectives to use special investigative techniques in order to solve these type of crimes.
Okay, got it. So, and what kind of victims do you tend to work with?
I work strictly with sexual assault victims, both adult and child victims.
Okay, got it. And how do Orange County law enforcement agencies work closely with BSC and other partners in the community? Okay.
When I first started this field of work back in 1999, we used to have to take our survivors to the hospital emergency room.
Oh, wow.
And then we would have to wait in the waiting room with the resident patients for the medical examiner to come in and perform the sexual assault exam and collect the forensic evidence for us. Sure. Since they created the VSC, we now have a very private place to take our survivors. It's called the Sexual Assault Treatment Center. Now, when we take our survivors to the treatment center, we have a nurse practitioner who's called a sexual assault nurse examiner waiting for us. She's the one that's going to conduct the sexual assault exam and collect the forensic evidence for us. They also provide the treatment, and there's also a victim advocate present. They also provide clothing for these survivors because in most cases we would take their clothing as evidence, so they would have to leave with clothing on, obviously, and the Victim Service Center provides that. We also work very closely with the prosecutor's office, with the state attorney's office. We in law enforcement, we investigate the case. We put the case package together, but the prosecutor is the one that has to present it to a jury. So we have to make sure that we have completed our investigation as thorough as possible so we can have a successful prosecution. Right. We also work with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, their laboratories. We have analysts that process DNA evidence and the toxicology. So their job is very important to our case.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of different pieces to this that I really didn't realize or think about, honestly. So it's amazing how we're seeing all these different pieces come together in our community to help support survivors and victims that need our help.
Yes.
You know, what is the sexual assault response team? So you're talking a little bit about the different agencies that you work with. So what is the sexual assault response team protocol? Why is it important that law enforcement and other first responders come at it from like the survivor lens?
So a sexual assault response team is comprised of the patrol officer, the nurse practitioner or the sexual assault nurse examiner, the victim advocate who provides all the emotional needs so the victim is able to continue with the reporting process. Right. And obviously the prosecutor's office and FDLE and all that. So it's one team that work together in order to build a case for the victim so the prosecutor can have this really good case to present to a jury.
Amazing, yeah. And you know, I think that sexual assault is one of the most underreported crimes ever. And I think one of the reasons why survivors don't come forward is because they're afraid of not being believed. So how do you, I know that you teach a class actually with other law enforcement and detectives and police detectives and things like that. How do you teach about start by believing?
So the first thing I tell them is like, you want to treat these survivors the same way you would want one of your loved ones, your family members, your coworkers, your friends to be treated if they're in this type of situation. That kind of brings it home to them. And then I want you to start by believing when you respond to these cases, because research shows that victims who's been through a traumatic experience may not be able to tell you the story or the event exactly the way it happened, because their brain kind of functions a different way, or malfunctions, if you can say it that way. So just because they can't tell you a logical story of what happened, or they can't tell you what happened in a chronological order, it doesn't mean it didn't happen. So we have to start by believing them, and then we can move forward from there. Yeah,
because I know that memory loss can be part of it as well. So you teach this, right?
I do.
That's amazing. Also, you know, what is the most rewarding thing about working with victims and survivors and your job, essentially?
You know, I've been thinking about that question. I'm thinking, I believe it's when the jury foreman comes out and gives us the guilty verdict. That means everybody in the team worked well together, and it was successful, from the first responder who took the initial report, to the nurse practitioner who collected the evidence for us, to the victim advocate, and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement laboratory analyst who processed the evidence for us, to the CSI who processed the crime scene, and the detective who put all this stuff together and presented it to the prosecutor. And then ultimately the prosecutor would present this to a jury and convince a jury that this person is guilty. But I think most importantly, it's the survivor themselves.
Right.
They're very, it takes a lot of courage to report this, and it takes a lot of courage to testify in court in front of a judge and jury and in front of the person who sexually assaulted you. Right. So without them testifying, this person can continue to abuse people.
Right, yeah, and that actually leads me to we only have like a few more minutes together, but I wanted to also ask that as well. I think that it does take a lot of courage. So what would you say to a survivor who may be nervous to talk to law enforcement or report or anything like that?
What I would recommend is for them to report to law enforcement as soon as they can. But if they're having doubts about that, contact the sexual assault hotline, where you can speak with an advocate, and from that point on they'll give you your options. You can have a forensic exam done and get the treatment. They will collect that evidence and save it for us in the event you change your mind and that you want to prosecute at a later date or pursue the case at a later date. We now have that evidence to go forward with.
That's amazing. And is there anything that you'd like to kind of share about, survivors, if you want to say anything to any survivors that may be listening right now?
I would just say thank you for reporting. Thank you for assisting us in the prosecution of these cases. You help us put these bad guys away, and so they can no longer hurt anybody else.
That's amazing. And I know that you do a lot of work with education as well. Do you find that that's really rewarding?
It is, when you start talking to college students who does not have a clue of what's going on in life. Right. And you just tell them, hey, you got to be careful when you go out on dates, and you got to think about who you're with and make sure you always bring somebody with you so you can get home safely. So it is rewarding when they come back to us and say, thank you for talking to us about that stuff.
Absolutely. And I know that you work with law enforcement too to teach them how to start by believing. So do you see that rewarding as well?
I do. I teach a lot of classes at the police academy, and although they might not be part of the sexual assault unit or the SVU, they're still out there. There are patrol officers out there that I teach them the same information I give these detectives in SVU. So they're well trained. They know that they need to start by believing. As a matter of fact, I make them make a pledge to start by believing
really?
when somebody tells them that they were
That's
sexually
awesome.
assaulted.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Detective Salcedo, for telling us more about the law enforcement agencies in Orange County and the amazing things that you do here.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And stay tuned as we are joined by Jenny Rossman from the State Attorney's Office to chat about what that process can look like. Stay with us. Welcome back to our final segment of the VSE Healing Begins Here podcast series. Today, we are talking about healing after assault to talk about the many options survivors have after experiencing sexual violence. We are joined by Jenny Rossman from the State Attorney's Office to talk about navigating the justice system as a survivor of sexual assault. So welcome, and thank you so much for being here, Jenny. We're really excited to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Emily. I'm excited to be here.
I'm really excited to have this conversation with you, and honestly, I'd like to learn a little bit more about the State Attorney's Office. So what is the State Attorney's Office and what do they do?
Yes, so the State Attorney's Office is the chief prosecuting agency for our judicial circuit, which is the Ninth Judicial Circuit. And we have an amazing state attorney, Monique Worrell, and our office is responsible for prosecuting all of the crimes that occur in Orange and Osceola counties.
Okay, got it. And what is a sex crimes unit specifically?
Yes, so we're really fortunate to have a designated sex crimes unit within the State Attorney's Office because we specialize in prosecuting those kinds of cases, and they present unique legal issues. But they're also really different than all other crimes because of the type and kind of experience of trauma that victims of sexual assault go through. So our attorneys and victim advocates are trained in being very victim-centered and trauma-informed in how we prosecute those cases.
And what exactly are those cases? So what kind of cases come through the State Attorney's Office in the sex crimes unit?
Yes, so we handle all of the sexual abuse of children cases, all sexual assault cases, and all human trafficking cases that happen in Orange and Osceola counties.
Absolutely. And can you tell me, you mentioned that there were some different players here, like the victim advocate and things like that. Can you tell me exactly what they do?
Yes, so within our unit we have 5 victim advocates, and then we have 7 prosecutors, and then I am the chief of the unit, so I supervise everyone. And we work as a team, so every case gets assigned to a victim advocate and a prosecutor who will work together. And the victim advocate is exactly what the description is, but they're advocating for the victim. They're making sure that the victim's voice is heard throughout the process, that the victim's informed of all of their rights, and that they're informed every step of the way and understand what's happening. And the prosecutor is the lawyer on the case. They're handling the legal side of things. They're kind of the brains behind, and they're also making the major decisions from filing to the resolution, but again, in a very victim-centered way.
Yeah, and I wanted to know specifically the definition of sexual battery. You said that there are a lot of different cases that you work with. So what exactly is sexual battery?
Yes, so sexual battery is the legal definition in Florida for kind of what is commonly referred to as rape. Every state has a different definition, but sexual battery in Florida, it encompasses sexual abuse of children. And then with adults, sexual battery is sex that is not consensual. Okay. And so in Florida, basically for sex to be legal, it has to be consensual. And so, both or all people have to give knowing, intelligent, and voluntary consent. Florida does not require a person to say no.
Oh, okay.
What is required is that there is consent, and,
Right.
and and again, it's voluntary, knowing, and intelligent consent. And there are things that can kind of affect someone's ability to consent. For instance, alcohol.
Yeah, sure.
And then kind of beyond just non-consensual sex, if a person uses violence or threats or a weapon, then that kind of becomes like a heightened in the seriousness of the crime as well.
Right. Yeah, consent obviously isn't an absence of a no. So in Florida, they recognize that.
Yes,
Okay.
it's an affirmative consent state, which is a really great thing.
Yeah, it is. Absolutely. And, I wanted to know kind of like the process. So
Sure.
what happens when an arrest is made? And then when does, if the state attorney's office files charges, things like that?
Okay, so when an arrest is made, the case automatically comes to the state attorney's office, and if it's a sexual abuse or sexual assault case, it comes directly to the sex crimes unit, and then it automatically, within like a day or two, gets assigned to the prosecutor and the victim advocate, who will handle that case from its inception to the end of that case. So it's the same team throughout, which gives victims continuity, and there's that opportunity to build a trusting relationship with the prosecutor and victim advocate. And so once the case is assigned, a big part of the process for us is having an initial meeting with the victim. Sometimes we need additional information before we can determine whether we're going to file charges, but also it can be the beginning of that relationship. It will allow the victim to have questions answered, to learn about the process, and for us to make sure that the victim has the resources that they need. To include, of course, like counseling through the Victim Service Center.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that this process can be kind of complicated. So what does it mean as the case moves from filing through resolution?
Sure. So once charges are filed, the person who is being charged is arraigned on the charges. They're told what the charges are. And then it is a long time before the case is going to kind of resolve, whether the resolution is going to be with a trial or ultimately with a plea, where the person who was charged is taking responsibility and accepting a sentence that the court is going to impose without a trial.
Okay.
In both of those scenarios, if it's a trial and the person's convicted, or at a plea, the victim has the right to be heard and to make an impact statement. And then in that in-between phase that can take like a year or a year and a half, especially with the COVID backlog, that is when, the defense side is investigating the case and maybe taking depositions of witnesses, and that could involve the victim being deposed. And so our job is just to make sure that the victim is prepared for that and understands what's happening as best as we can.
Absolutely. And I think that, what would you say to a survivor who might be nervous to go through this kind of complicated process?
Yes. I think, first of all, that it would be completely normal to feel nervous.
Right.
That person experienced a trauma of sexual assault, and now they're kind of thrust into the criminal justice system. And, they're obviously a strong person because they reported it. And so we know they're courageous, but we're going to make sure that they will be as prepared as possible for all of the different things that could happen, and that they they have that knowledge, which would hopefully help them feel less nervous.
I just love that you all have victim advocates, and you're amazing, so that's really awesome too. So I just love that there's all these different people that are helping survivors navigate through this. Let's say that a case at the state attorney's office, they can't file charges against that case.
Yes.
So does this mean that the state attorney's office doesn't believe the survivor, or that the sexual battery didn't happen?
Definitely not. The decision when we can't go forward generally is because we just don't have enough evidence. And unfortunately, there are times where we believe a victim 100% about what happened, but we cannot meet our burden. And so we can't file charges. And that's, a really hard part of the job.
Yeah.
And when we have to call, the victim with the victim advocate to give that news, we always tell them, we believe you 100%. You're so courageous. Please don't let our filing decision make you think that we didn't believe you.
And is there anything else that you'd like to say to the survivors out there who may be listening?
Yes, that I really feel like it is a privilege and an honor to do this work on their behalf, and we just always will endeavor to do our best so that we can achieve justice for them.
Absolutely. I just want to thank you so much from the State Attorney's Office. Thanks so much for being here. I've learned so much from you. I know that you all have amazing victim advocates. You're all survivor focused, and I just really appreciate you taking the time to share with us a little bit about what that process can look like, because it could be really complicated, but I love that you all are there for survivors. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me, Emily, and we love being partners with the VSC.
Thank you. And if you would like to learn more about the VSC, please visit healhere.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear, and you are not alone. So thank you so much, Jenny. It was great seeing you.